Hey guys, it looks like the video we recorded in class didn't work. I'm going to look at trying to get another short video out and seeing if I can get that to move over for you guys. What we talked about last time in class and what we reviewed was bad debt expense. And so that's what we're really going to be looking at today is that bad debt expense. I'm going to break it up into a couple of videos so that I don't have the problem of it loading like I did last week. So the first thing that I want to look at is the direct write-off method. Now, under the direct write-off method, what we are looking at is when we have small companies that do not have a whole lot of accounts receivable. Their write-offs are not really material in nature. They don't have a whole lot of write-offs that they do. And so they do not follow GAAP, and therefore they do write it off right away. So, for instance, if I had a company that had a customer that they knew they were not going to be getting the money. So we're going to say that we had a customer $1,000 from M. Gray, and they found out that she was not going to pay them, and they were using this direct write-off method. What they would do is they actually would go in and they would have and directly write off the account to bad debt expense. So you would have bad debt expense would be your debit account, and then your credit account would be not the allowance account here. It would actually be the accounts receivable account for M. Gray. And so that would be the credit account that you would be using would be for M. Gray. So that is how we look at this direct write-off. The other things that we have to look at with direct write-off, what happens if, 2 months later, she pays us? What do we have to do? Well, what we would have to do is we would have to go back in and we would have to reverse the entry that we had already made. So we would have to debit the accounts receivable account for M. Gray because we have to put that money back into that account. And then what we would look at is we would take it back out of bad debt expense because it's no longer bad debt because she's paying us. And then the second entry we would make is we would actually be making the journal entry to collect that cash, and we would credit her account. And so those would be the entries that we would make when we are looking at direct write-off method with accounting. The other method that I want to look at here is the allowance method. Now, the allowance method that I'm going to look at here is going to be the first allowance method, and I'll do another video on the second allowance method. But the first allowance method we can use would be something like the percentage of sales. So when I look at the percentage of sales method, it would say something like our allowance for doubtful accounts would be 1% of our sales. And then what we would see is that our sales would maybe be $100,000. So what we would do with this particular method is we would take that $100,000, we would then multiply that by that 1%, and what we would find is that our bad debt would be $1,000. So this right here would be our journal entry amount. So when we get ready to do this particular journal entry, you will see that we still have the debit account being bad debt expense. But our credit account here will actually be this allowance account because this is the allowance method. So we would say allowance for doubtful accounts for $1,000. And so that's really, this is the simplest of the allowance methods because we just take what we're given, we find the amount, and then we use that amount. Now, we also have times when we have to write off our debt. So we figure out somebody's really not going to pay us, so we need to write it off. And let's say that we have a person that owes us money, and we're just going to say that ABC Corp owes us $500, and we found out we're not going to get that money. So what we have to do in this case to write it off, we would actually use the allowance account as our debit account for that $500, and then we would have the actual writing it off to accounts receivable for ABC Corporation, and that would be our credit for $500. Now, what happens if they come back and they pay us later after we've already written it off? Well, what's going to happen is we will have to reverse the entry that we just made. So when we reverse that particular entry, what you'll see is we have to put it back into the accounts receivable account. And then we also have to put it, or take it back out of that allowance for doubtful account for that $500. And then we will actually collect this money, just like we did in the previous problem, where we had cash, and then we have the accounts receivable for ABC. And so this is how we would actually make all the entries that we need to make under the allowance method for sales. Now, the last two entries that we made, or the last three entries we made, when we look at the write-off and we look at what happens if they pay us later, works for both allowance methods. Not just the percentage of sales. It also works for the percentage of accounts receivable, and it works for the aging of accounts receivable. So this is how you would write it off, and you would pay us later whenever we are looking at this. So these entries right here do work the same for both allowance methods. The actual entries that you're going to make are not going to change no matter which allowance method you are using. All right, and so that pretty much does it for our allowance methods. So we are pretty much finished with this one, and we will get started